Hi everyone, my name is Maša and I'm happy to welcome you to Tactics and Practice, the series of conferences that Aksioma organizes every year since 2010 at Kinoshishkan in Ljubljana. This year we host the 8th edition of Money Lab, the international network of artists, activists and geeks who experiment with forms of financial democratization. Like many other events scheduled for spring 2020, also this one had to be adapted and reformulated due to the pandemic. We opted for a series of weekly streaming appointments taking place every Monday at 5 p.m. Central European Time at aksioma.org/moneylab8. The real estate financial complex has transformed housing into an investment opportunity for an increasingly unequal concentration of global surplus capital. Housing is no longer a source of individual or social stability and security, but of constant tension, conflict, and exploitation. How can communities in current conditions of financial plunder and state removal come together to construct other scenarios? How can we develop new mechanisms of communal control that will once again embed housing markets in local social relations that will treat housing as a communal resource and human right? Can we imagine another system that will not be based on housing as an investment, but will see it as a home? For today's panel entitled Housing Hacking the Crisis of Home, we asked artist and researcher Vienne to present her speculative framework for community currency that can be used for home ownership. Architects and researchers Maksym, Rokmaniko and Francesco Sebregondi to talk about the platform for equitable housing, DOMA, and journalist and podcaster Lenart Kučić to tell us more about his investigation into the impact of Airbnb on the housing situation in Ljubljana. The panel is moderated by sociologist Klemen Ploštajner of the Zadrugator housing cooperative established to provide affordable and quality living conditions in Ljubljana. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to remind you to use the web chat on the MoneyLab8 website to share with us your comments and questions during the debate. Towards the end of the sessions, our collaborator Mikanovič will dismiss the role of chat moderator to become your avatar and give voice to comments and questions you wrote in the chat. Vienne, Maksym, Francesco, Leonard, welcome. Klemen, take it away.
Hello all, and welcome to this discussion. I would like to first thank the organizers and especially all the guests for their contribution to the debate. Today's event will consist of 3 presentations. 2 will be of more speculative nature, and 1 will be more, let's say, concrete research project. And all 3 presentations will be followed by the discussion. But before diving into the presentations, let me just first take some time to frame the discussion with a short introduction. First frame that we need to put is connected to obvious cause, to the obvious condition of housing crisis that we are experiencing through the whole world and in all countries that presentators are coming from. This housing crisis is now being exacerbated and, let's say, revealed by the COVID crisis. On the one hand, we have insecurity, unaffordability, overcrowding, privatization of social housing that causes what Madon and Marcuse named residential alienation, so people without security, safe housing environment, let's say. Just a couple of data to point this out. First one is that 60% of renters in UK cannot afford unexpected expenses. 20% of renters before COVID crisis in the United States couldn't afford to pay rent. Now this percentage is more than 35%. And in Slovenia, a third of people pay more than 40% of their income for housing. This is one level of the crisis. Another level of the crisis is, on the other hand, we have concentration of wealth, renter economy that is based on extraction of value from land or housing, financialization of home ownership, and indebtedness. So on the one hand, we have insecurity. On the other hand, we have concentration of wealth and inequalities. So through housing crisis, inequalities are being reproduced, deepened, and also housing crisis produces its own dynamics and its own inequalities. So if this is a general frame, today's discussion, I would say, will follow three main topics, let's say. First one is social relations in housing. So we cannot think of different forms of tenure as something that is given, but something that is socially constructed, and it's based on different social conditions. We will see that in all of three presentations. If we take ownership, ownership is not something that is given, but it is something that is socially constructed in a way excluding people from certain objects. It's connected to how the wealth and value is appropriated. And it's also not connected to the individual decisions, but it is constructed by how state and markets are operating. So the questions that we will pose are who has the right to use, what kind of ways of using it, and who is appropriating value. So this is one point of the discussion. Second point that I think is really interesting is technology level of everything. How different technological tools are exacerbating the crisis. They are not the cause of the housing crisis, but they are the tools that are exacerbating it. Airbnb is one of them, but we also have different ones, especially financial markets, how they are operating and how different technologies on the financial markets, different instruments are deepening housing crisis. So this technological level will also be one point. And the third obvious one will be alternatives, so new forms of organizing, especially two speculative presentations will be focusing on that, how to use technology to organize differently, or how to base housing on different social relations that are now based on. So this just general frame, and also in what way I'll try to moderate the discussion. I think it's that we can give the word to our first presenters, who are DOMA City, which is a shared ownership housing platform for equitable housing. Let's say speculative scenario, how to enlarge access to housing wealth while at the same time strengthening local communities and the position of renters. And it will be presented by Maksym and Francesco. So Maksym and Francesco, word is yours.
Right. Thank you for the invitation to be part of ML8. I must say that the previous sessions were really engaging and also kind of helpful to wrap our heads around these very strange times we're living in. And also we're particularly pleased to be part of this panel called Hacking the Crisis of Home. In a way, I think the formula captures really well what DOMA tries to do, as we'll try to explain to you.
Right, and it's always been nice to present DOMA because we all know what the issue is. Housing crisis might be like different in different parts of the world, but the patterns are the same. There's a bunch of research that shows kind of evidence how housing is this kind of key driver in increasing the gap between different classes in terms of increasing wealth inequality. So owning a home has become this luxury that fewer and fewer people can afford. And increasing amount of people are basically resigning themselves to a lifetime of rent.
As we can see also from these charts that show the kind of widening gap between household median income and average house prices over time, and it's only getting worse. So around this perspective of the lifetime of rent, maybe just to be clear, it's not like we've got anything against rent per se, but we can all agree perhaps that we have a problem when this perspective of the lifetime of rent means enduring social precarity due to rent taking a growing share of every household's income, as well as lack of stability, because the kind of risk of eviction always looms over the horizon for many around the world. So, again, we won't be dwelling too much on like painting this grim landscape of housing, but we'll be focusing today on strategies for fixing this broken housing market.
Right, so as a response, we basically developed DOMA is a platform for equitable housing, the way we call it. And the main idea behind DOMA is kind of this attempt to redesign the financial architecture of housing. So both of us are architects by training, so it might have been tempting to kind of work with housing crisis on the kind of literal level of buildings, but instead we focus on this kinds of circuits of value that are attached to them. And in this way, DOMA is this kind of urban software that connects city residents and existing stocks of residential units in a different way. And in this way, we propose a new ownership model, one which basically enables access to housing market for all of those who are currently priced out of it.
Right. So to give you an overview of DOMA today, we would like to go over these 4 key points. First, DOMA is a platform cooperative. Its main operation is the crowd buying of property, which it uses so as to fairly redistribute equity and in the long run with the horizon of turning housing into a commons.
Right, so the first point is this idea of a platform cooperative. And DOMA is very much inspired by the traditional cooperative model. We like cooperatives. I mean, there are many ideas that we can borrow from them. People can pool their resources together to raise their collective buying power. People can lower their cost per member in all the services and products that are associated with home ownership. And I guess to this, we can just add this kind of scalability that can be brought by digital technology. And in this case, we are very much inspired by smart contracts. So, well, traditional cooperative model is somehow requiring a lot of trust from members to coordinate. With DOMA, we're trying to establish the conditions for people that don't know each other to coordinate on their common goals. So gaining equity, investing into their city, keeping housing affordable, etc. So, yeah, I mean, in this way, smart contracts become these kinds of means to secure conditions of association among multitude of urban dwellers and to then enable them to coordinate at scale.
Mm-hmm. I want to be quick, but that also brings us to the second point, which is that of crowd buying of property. So, you know, the key changes that DOMA brings somehow to the housing market is to enable access to this market with a radically reduced threshold of entry. Basically, you know, in our model, even if you have €100 in savings, you can invest into the housing market, you can invest into your neighborhood, into, you know, your local area, etc. And this is made possible by this crowd buying of housing. Concretely, the platform issues DOMA tokens, which are digital titles of property that are backed by real property assets. And by purchasing DOMA tokens, members acquire shares of the DOMA network of properties and become stakeholders in the platform. As such, they also become entitled to their share of the rent that comes out of the entire network of property.
Yeah, which brings us to the third point, which is redistribution of equity. So DOMA buys housing with a view to rent it, but it applies this sustainable model where it basically enables progressive transition from rent to ownership. The way it's done is that tenants receive DOMA shares in return to every rent they pay. So between 10 to 15% of their rent is basically returned to them as equity. And in this way, the more you stay within DOMA, the more shares you accumulate. And as Francesco said, it then decreases your effective rent. Yeah, and I mean, in this way, it kind of, we're trying to address this issue of, you know, it's very often the case that sort of neighborhoods are growing in value. That kind of increase of value is generated by all of the stakeholders, all of the people who dwell there, all of the owners of shops and whoever is participating in the life of that area, and it's very much the case that that kind of value increase is often taken over by this kind of landlord class. So instead of that scenario, DOMA is kind of aimed at kind of gathering both owners and tenants into the same community of interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which allows us to shift to the fourth and sort of more long-term point of turning housing into a commons. So, you know, with DOMA, you've got a community of stakeholders that are collectively owning a network of properties, which is a quite radical step away from the kind of model of home ownership we have, the traditional one-to-one relationship between a single family household and a single residential unit. So by turning this network of housing into a commons, we also see DOMA as a vehicle that would facilitate the emergence of new and alternative models of urban living, of organizing, of cooperating, of sharing, of caring, you know, that maybe are not represented or not present within the kind of existing family-based model of housing we've got, and on the contrary, that would better fit the kind of diversity of the urban condition of today. And this is really important for us.
Right. Then to conclude, we just wanted to share a bit of what kinds of things we are working on and a bit of the practice of DOMA. So since we started the project in 2017, we've basically been designing, as we said in the beginning, this kind of alternative financial architecture for housing, and you know, all the circuits of value within it, kind of how to make sure the kind of residents are getting their kind of equity and so on and so forth. So with Olesa Kovalenko and Francis Tseng, we've developed this generic housing market simulation that tests DOMA logics in different contexts in different cities. We also did a bunch of workshops all across Europe, and kind of to also kind of get the sense of how DOMA kind of maps into kind of real contexts. And then we developed this multiplayer game based on that simulation, which is kind of introduces the principles of DOMA to the broader audience in an interactive way. And you can actually play the game via play.doma.city. Maybe you will kind of understand how it works a bit even better. Yeah, and at the same time, to kind of, while we kind of looked at that systematic scale of simulating and kind of trying to understand a bit of data behind housing markets, we also have this kind of one instance property, which we currently are working with and kind of prototyping how DOMA works on the scale of one unit, with all of the nitty-gritty of, like, you know, looking at the bureaucratic part, looking at payments and how to, looking at all of the technical kind of issues that might kind of arise if you start implementing something like DOMA.
Yeah, our first DOMA house, from which Maksym is actually speaking to you right now. Right, so to conclude, I mean, this is where we are. We're actually very happy to be finalizing the first round of seed funding that hopefully will, you know, allow us to shift gears in the development of DOMA, and as we are saying here, maybe bring it to your city as soon as possible. But also, and you know, really as a last word to conclude here, and I think this is going to be probably a topic of discussion later on, what is very much in our mind these days is how to prepare for, you know, the post-COVID world. We are entering into a phase of global economic recession. There's little doubt about it. We don't yet know how the housing markets will react to this condition. I think it's too early to say, but what we see, at least from our perspective, is also an opportunity to move away from like business as usual in the housing world and kickstart alternative models of housing, such as DOMA, as well as many others that will potentially, you know, help fixing this long broken model that we have and allow us to, you know, build upon a better infrastructure and basis. So that's kind of our long-term ambition, but we also would like to conclude our presentation here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thanks to Maksym and Francesco. So from one alternative, or from one speculation to another speculative alternative, which is especially interesting for our context in Slovenia because it's based on Croatia, which has a relatively similar housing infrastructure, institutions, organizational models that are that we see in Slovenia. The model was designed by Vienne Chan. She's an artist and researcher and active, among other things, with forms of ownership. So Vienne, please present your model.
Okay, so I will be presenting a design for a parallel currency based on the socioeconomic challenges in Zagreb, Croatia. So just a quick summary of what those challenges are. Well, first of all, there's the housing issue, which is the theme of this panel. And then additionally, local business there have trouble securing capital, so it affects their ability to grow. So they have trouble, so the local economy is weakened. And you combine housing and this lack of a weakened local economy together, and what you have is a brain drain effect where young, skilled workers are just leaving the country because their living conditions are too hard. And a lot of this is basically a lack of access to money. So the idea is that by introducing a parallel currency, we can increase access to money to those who don't currently have it. So a parallel currency is basically a community currency, but the emphasis is that by using the word parallel, we acknowledge the need to interact with the external system outside of the community. One issue is that a lot of existing community currencies have an issue with liquidity. It's we're always thinking about, well, where can I spend this new community currency, which shops, what I can buy with it. But this becomes a fundamental weakness, because when you think about it, if you look at your own expenses, shopping, food, or these kinds of consumer purchases are actually rarely your biggest purchase, and they're actually the most flexible. But your biggest expense is, for most people, is almost always housing, whether it's it's rent or a mortgage payment, and this is absolutely inflexible. So the idea in what I'm going to propose today is that we create a parallel currency that uses housing to anchor the value of the currency. Bearing in mind that in Croatia, a lot of the landlords in Croatia tend to be pensioners who are not particularly wealthy, and so this is the beginning of the scheme. So I'm going to start with this model. So we group landlords together into a group. We call it LG here. We'll give them we'll create a legal entity out of them. Then the landlords select a few local businesses, small and medium enterprises, so SME, so 1, 2, and 3 here. You group them together, and then when you group them together, the landlord creates a securitized loan for these SMEs. So a securitized loan is just basically like a loan, but with more participants, and then you average out the risk. So the loan is written in, let's say the loan is worth 100. So it's written in 60 coin, which is, let's say, the name I give this parallel currency for now. and 40 kuna. The kuna is, of course, the national currency in Croatia issued by the government. So there's the securitized loan. Then LG, the landlords, they sell these loans to the general public for 100 kuna. And, you know, the idea is that within 1 year's time or another desired time frame, the public will receive a certain percentage of interest, for example, 3%. And then the public gives 100 kuna to the landlords group. So now the landlords have 100 kuna. And then the landlord splits up, then the landlords give these SMEs money. So the landlords will give, as per the loan, the SMEs 60 coins and 40 kuna. So now the public is holding coin. What can you do with it? Well, since the coin was issued by the landlord, the public can pay a percentage of his or her rent with coin, this parallel currency. Then, of course, there are other SMEs, and you can also, for example, spend your coin at other SMEs. And then the SMEs can, for example, also pay part of their rent with coin. And then with the interactions with other SMEs, with local SMEs, you can also help conduct local transactions with coin, freeing up, you know, if you have limited access to kuna, then it frees up your kuna reserve, or it saves part of your kuna reserve. And then the SMEs can also pay a percentage of salaries with coin, and this, of course, can be, you know, if necessary, depending on the situation, the landlords can even further subsidize this salary, and then the worker can also pay a percentage of the rent with this coin again. And then we have foreign businesses, so basically any business that is outside of this immediate community. Whether it be in Croatia or whether it be, I don't know, in Germany or so on. So this is why it's important for the loan to be written in a mixture of coin and kuna. So when you're dealing with a business outside of this immediate circle, then you use your reserve of kunas for external transactions, and then, you know. And then the transaction is made in kuna, and this brings more kuna back into the community. And then eventually the SMEs will pay back the loan to the landlords, and then the landlords will pay back the promised interest on the loan, the 3% or whatever percent that was decided upon, back to the public. So that's the basic scheme of things, and it leverages upon it basically, where this difference is that everything is based on the fact that you can use this parallel currency to pay your rent, and that almost everyone needs to pay rent. And that's my project in short. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vienne. Before we continue, we had some problems with noise, which are pretty interesting for our discussion because there were construction noises. I think we solved this problem. Second thing I want to say before we continue with the next presentation is that you are all who are listening and viewing the discussion invited to add comments or post questions if you're interested. Now you see the chat. You post them in chat. Please post them during the discussion so that organizers are able to collect questions and pose them to our presentators at the end. So the next presentation, it's less speculative, more concrete, but it's kind of connected to all that we were saying because it's based on different financial architecture. While Vienne was talking about how to, let's say, localize value, this model of Airbnb is extracting value from certain localities and pouring it into financial markets, let's say, or international markets. It's a presentation from Lenart Kučić, journalist from Podčerto, and he will be talking about the analysis of Airbnb in Ljubljana.
Hi, hello everybody. Yes, we wanted to make it less speculative and hopefully we'll succeed at that. Basically, we are, as investigative journalists, we were informed by quite a few people, especially students and some other renters, that it's getting extremely hard to get an apartment in Ljubljana and also expensive. And the students were complaining that the owners are actually forcing them to move out during the, from May and then over the summer because they want to actually host some people on Airbnb and they don't really need the long-term renters. And there are also a lot of complaint from other residents in Ljubljana that they don't have parking places because there are so many foreigners taking their place and they're not paying, the common costs of cleaning and garbage and everything. But anecdotes are not enough by itself. So we said maybe there was, slide 1 and slide 2, it's more an illustration of how it works. Then, of course, we started looking on how somebody who comes from Ljubljana and where will he or she end. And then we started looking on Airbnb. This is it's an illustration photo, but you can see that there's a lot of ideas how to combine this very cozy feeling and then Slovenian potica and everything and Airbnb. So we actually saw that there's quite a lot of things happening on Airbnb, but of course, then we were checking the data and we were looking, through the media reports, and they were all saying that, yeah, Airbnb is a big problem. And there was an estimate, there are like a lot of apartments in Ljubljana on Airbnb, but we never knew how many, because if you go to Airbnb and then you just, type in Ljubljana, you will of course get some number of hits, but they don't really mean a lot. So we said, well, maybe we should do it like in some other cities. And then together with the NGO Dan se no dan, it's a group of ethical and hackers, let's say, we conducted an investigation and said we want to really see what's the situation of Airbnb in Ljubljana. And then we were scrapping data from Airbnb from June to November 2018. And we also used some data from the company called RDNA. It's also a company that provides commercial analysis for Airbnb owners, but we only used it, to check if our results are comparable and maybe if that we're not off too much. And what we found out on the next slide, when we used all the data that we got from RDNA and from our research, we actually saw that, of course, that the number of places that are available in Ljubljana, it can be houses or apartments, only a few rooms, actually. We can see that there's a lot of, seasonal goings ups and downs. During the summer, of course, there are more people, and during the winter, it's less people. But if you see the median, there's quite an increase of how many places are being offered on Airbnb. So we got quite a lot of data, and after a couple of months, we got the results. And on the next slide, it's only an illustration. it's one of the illustrations. We used, this data and locations and everything to actually map how many places were put on Airbnb in Ljubljana and what's the concentration. And the good thing was that we could also use the number of comments, feedbacks, which is cool, because if you've ever used Airbnb, you know that they're really persistent. They really want you to actually leave a feedback. And we said, well, we can use feedback data to actually estimate occupancy. So if there was a specific location that's been on offer on Airbnb, and if they got, let's say, reviews all year long, we said, well, maybe they are not just, a sharing economy, just offering a free room for maybe a couple of weeks or something, but it could be a commercial business. So from our results, we could see that there was around 1,600 different places that were put on Airbnb in Ljubljana, and almost like 2/3 of those places, from 800 to 900, were there available for pretty much all year. But there is a problem, because now we had the data on how much properties are there on Airbnb, but to answer our basic question, is the RB to blame that the rents are getting higher and then the flats are less available for students and other residents in Ljubljana? We said, well, we don't really know, because 1,600 places, is it a lot? Is it not a lot? Is there, how many apartments are there in Ljubljana that are available to rent? Are we talking about, I don't know, 10,000 or 5,000 or how many? And what we learned is that there is no way to tell, for very specific reason, because in Slovenia, a lot of homeowners are similar in Croatia, are individual persons, and the state has very limited access to see, what an individual is actually doing with his or her property. And we know that quite a lot of apartments in Ljubljana are empty, but we have no idea how many. And for that reason, we saw that there is no way that we can say whether Airbnb is to blame for this situation in Ljubljana. But what we have seen is that, okay, that there is no data, that's one big problem that we can talk about later. But what we also saw is that the state has absolutely no idea what to do with Airbnb. Like, first, they had no idea it's going on. Then they started reacting, but not as a matter of any real policy, be it on the state or on the city level. But the state was bothered primarily with, let's say, gray economy, that if I'm actually renting my place on Airbnb and I'm getting paid a couple of thousands of euro for that I don't pay taxes for it. So the only thing that the state did was that they started using data to actually find people who are renting places on Airbnb and not paying taxes. So that's the only reason. But what also happened was that the state then said, well, the only way that you can legally rent your place on Airbnb is to register as a commercial renter. And the problem is that in such a way they effectively delegalized, I wouldn't say criminalized, it's too much to say, but delegalized the idea of a sharing economy, that I can actually use Airbnb as a platform for its original intent. Let's say that I move away for a week or a month, and then I just don't want my place to be empty, and then I just want somebody who's probably nice, from France or Spain or whatever, to actually use my place and be in Ljubljana for a while. But it's not legal anymore, because if I want to do it and don't have any problems with my tax authority, I need to register. But paying a registration and actually owning a small business is, again, too expensive to rent my place for a week or two or a month or two. So it effectively means that the state destimulates the idea of sharing economy. On the other hand, it does not regulate or limit using platform capitalism. So the idea was that, especially before the corona outbreak, it made much more sense to actually use your flat for a lot of short-term rents than to have somebody there who actually lives there. But what happened after Corona is, again, anecdotally, we learned that those people who actually invested quite a lot of money in promotion and maybe even buying some places for Airbnb were desperate because they had no guests and everybody canceled, and they were trying to actually find somebody who would pay the rent and live there. So all of a sudden, the students who were in high demand or other people who would like to actually take a rent in Ljubljana. But what we also see is, in the next slide, I just got some fresh data from RDNA because we have not been scrapping our own, that it was, again, more or less anecdotal because active properties have not fallen for much. So you cannot see a significant drop of active properties, but you could see, of course, a significant drop of new bookings. But even those bookings are, going back to not normal, but they're significantly higher than maybe 2 months ago. So what we see is that nothing really changed. We are still not able to make any real analysis based on we are not able to make any real policy because we still lack the data. So a year ago, it was anecdotal that Airbnb is to blame for everything that's wrong on the real estate market in Ljubljana. Then a couple of months ago, it was like, now when Airbnb is gone, we're back to normal. You can again find an affordable apartment in Ljubljana even now. But as we can see now, things are going so-called back to normal. And maybe as we can see on the next slide, yes, the occupancy rates are still way lower than they were last year during the same period. But we can see that nothing really radically changed during the pandemic. And if Airbnb is not really terribly hit globally, because we know that they're not making money and actually they're losing money, nothing will really change or happen in Ljubljana. So what I'd really like to do another analysis this year, to get our own information. But basically, we can still see that the state is pretty blind, for this difference between sharing economy that should be in a way supported and platform capitalism that only extracts and finalizes real estate from this environment to one global corporation. Nothing has been done to actually do a change or prevent that, or maybe stimulate long-term rent through, I don't know, different kind of taxation or whatever. So that's a short summary of our findings. I'll be glad to answer some more questions if you have any specific, on the data, on the outcomes. But basically, I don't think that we are nearly or any closer to any long-term solution on how to actually make better use of real estate in Ljubljana. A lot of places are still empty, and there are a lot of anecdotes. I talked to one lawyer who deals a lot of, with this when somebody dies and then the courts need to decide who gets what. And they said that a lot of apartments are empty in Ljubljana for a very simple reason, because their nominal price is really high. And if there are like 3 different people who actually inherit this apartment, there's always a problem, because either nobody has the money to buy off the apartment from other people because the nominal prices are too high. And on the other hand, they have pretty low income, so they don't have enough money to either invest in this apartment or even to decide to, share it. So basically, the only people who really profited from Airbnb are maybe some small specialized agencies who actually manage Airbnb properties and do pretty much everything. It's also true that we don't really have what kind of impact, for example, a booking would have, because they have a local office and they're in Slovenian, and they're, again, people say that they're quite popular, but we have no way, to actually to cross examine or to get the data, like how many properties are there both on Airbnb and Booking, or how many properties were actually only put there for a platform and have not been, on the market for regular renters. So that's in short, but I'm looking forward for a discussion.
Thanks, Leonard. So we continue with the discussion. I have two general questions that I'll pose to everyone. And first one, I will develop it from Leonard's analysis, especially his point that Airbnb is not the problem or the main mechanism; it's only the symptom. And this symptom was probably best described by Anna Minton in her discussion of London. She analyzed the difference between Airbnb owners and social renters. And for her, she said that empty room for an owner of an apartment is an opportunity, a business opportunity to extract more wealth, while for the social renter in England, new system of bedroom tax is if you have an additional room, if you're a social renter, you're basically fined for it. So on the one hand, we have people who use their homes and are taxed if they have additional space, while owners are even awarded if they have more and more rooms through new mechanisms and new technologies. And this is basically connected to the general theme that I posed at the beginning, which is the social relationships on which housing is based. So the general question for all of you is on what kind of social relations do you think that today are the most problematic that the housing is based on, and how your models and your analysis for Leonard would help us to think how housing could be based on different social relations. And we can go in the same order as discussions, as presentations were. So DOMA, Vienne, and then Leonard.
Sure. Maksym, should I start? And anyways, we'll do it like that. So thanks for this question. It's great to start on something so central, I think, to the problem of housing today. Just speaking from the perspective of DOMA, we have tried to focus on this very specific aspect of the housing crisis, which is essentially the question of access to the housing market. We're starting from an acknowledgement that housing and our homes have been financialized. They've been so for over 50 years, and we live in a world in which housing is a financialized object. And so we're focusing also on tactics, and as it's the kind of theme of this set of panels and discussion, to change these conditions from the inside. I guess this also resonates with the question of hacking. And in that sense, like you were speaking of London before to Anna Minton, I've lived in London for several years, and there's this expression that you hear basically every day about like getting on the property ladder, and it's incredible how much in London, which really is a sort of cluster of this global housing crisis, it's in every people's mind, and you've got like such a strong social divide between homeowners and renters, and everybody's aware that the longer they stay in this tenants class, the harder it's going to be to move to this ladder, which is really a social ladder, essentially. And so, in a way, I guess DOMA as a project is very much about sort of bringing down this property ladder by accepting, unfortunately, that this is a condition within which housing has been financialized, and that it is an asset that can be lucrative and can be can represent like a very important container of contemporary value. Our focus is on making it accessible to a wider basis, so as to so that this financial asset becomes a sort of empowering tool, on the basis of which we can also rethink what a home can be. But first, we need actually the tools to to be secure in our home and to have a much more sustainable model of relationship to housing. Please, Maksym, if you want to continue. I think you're muted.
Yes, I was. Sorry. I was saying that I think it's also like to bring it back to the kind of money and money lab. I think it's kind of also very interesting to think about how these social relationships are then they are kind of the product of these kind of financial derivatives, right? And I think the sort of the thing that Francesco was saying about financialization and all of those things that kind of we have been talking about and hearing from also other presenters. It's really important to acknowledge that those kinds of things like financial derivatives, they're not like something extremely scary and something that we cannot deal with, but actually is something that can be a subject of design. And we can look at these problems and see how they are kind of engraved into existing financial mechanisms and kind of try to think about the alternative portfolio of tools that we can kind of develop to address them.
So,
Okay, Vienne. Yeah, continue.
Yeah, okay. So on the Airbnb thing, I think there are kind of chains of people renting out, you can say. First, perhaps more in the Croatia scene, is you have smaller landlords who basically they don't have enough revenue, so they use rent to size their lack of income to make ends meet. And then perhaps in more so-called Western countries, then you have this phenomenon of basically companies buying up properties to rent it out almost at a professional level. So there needs to be a bit of a distinction between the two. And maybe talk a bit about the smaller landlords first, because I'm also not 100% sure about the word sharing economy. But anyway, let's talk a bit about the smaller landlords, because I think this whole phenomenon on housing as a source of income reflects a general economic malaise. The fact that people cannot make ends meet if they don't rent out a room in their apartment or if they don't exploit other people, this makes you ask, well, what has been happening in the general economy? What happened there? And if you look at the UK, the UK's way to fix this was actually to give out rent subsidies. But what this actually did was it increased the floor price of rent, making the situation worse, while it could also have gone the other way and actually built public housing. So we also need to, when we think about this whole situation, relate it back to the greater economy. And how basically we're seeing a privatization of what should be public space, because the state has kind of almost withdrawn itself from its responsibilities, I would say. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think this is a really important general point, and I think that maybe Leonard will probably, in connection to Airbnb analysis in Ljubljana, have something to say about it, because, like you said, Vienne, it's not only about like we have this landlord proprietive class that owns everything and rents it out. We also have like small landlords who are subsidizing basically their low income and pensions, and this is a construction of the economy for the last 30 years that we need to individualize, privatize our well-being through the wealth that we already own or we were able to own through privatization process. So Leonard, do you see anything similar on the Airbnb scene in Ljubljana, or do we only see small entrepreneurs concentrating flats in Ljubljana?
Well, it's probably a combination of both because, yeah, it's pretty similar to Croatia because a lot of small personal owners who sometimes just want to make some extra money, or sometimes they're forced to make some extra money in order to, yeah, complement their small pensions, or maybe they're not even employed. So there's one of the ideas that in Slovenia we have a lot of so-called hidden poverty that we don't really know. It's not visible because in the States or in some other places, if you cannot afford to pay the rent, or if you're poor, it's very likely that you will lose a place to live and then you will become homeless. It's very rare in Slovenia. But there are some authors who claim that the reason is that people are actually living in very expensive flats, in the sense expensive of they could be sold for quite a lot of money, especially in center of Ljubljana, for example. But they can hardly afford, to put something in their fridge. And of course, they cannot either invest anything in the apartment, and the apartments can be in pretty poor conditions, and we really don't know what to do with this kind of thing. And then the other is that we try to talk to quite a lot of experts on the field, and they said, well, maybe that there would be an option because there are like two sides of the story. You have, when it comes to anecdote, we have, the poor student who's trying to find an affordable flat. On the other hand, people who are renting the flats, they are full of anecdotes of so-called, like somebody who comes in and then demolishes the apartment, or really, and then they wouldn't even pay the rent, and then it would be almost impossible for the landowner to actually evict this kind of person. So we have like scare 1 and scare 2, and one of the reasons is that also people who do own the apartments and could afford to maybe own them, to rent them, they decide not to because they're too afraid that at the end they will have a lot of damage on their apartment, and they will stick to this terrible person and who won't move out. And there was the idea that maybe the state, what the state could do, and there are some models of that maybe there should be a kind of a public agency that could actually, for example, if I own the apartment and I don't need it, then I actually give this apartment to this public agency to run everything. So in the sense that I get the share of it, but they would have a network of affordable housing that would not be rented commercially, and with no pressure from Airbnb and something like that. And then I, as a as an owner of this property, would have better taxation because I would give this apartment for, let's say, non-commercial use and stuff like that. So there was some ideas in this side, but I think that they were still pretty much locked in this lockdown between distrust of people to the state and then people to other people. And for that reason, I think that there is a lot of empty or underused space that could be available also for this kind of thing. And of course, the third thing is that our state have not been investing a lot in the non-profit or affordable housing for, let's say, young families or whoever. The average, I think that Klemen knows it better, but that there are two things. That the average age of an apartment in Slovenia is pretty old. I mean, 40 to 50 years, because those buildings were built, I think, mostly in the 60s and 70s when these huge waves of urbanization and a lot of flats have been built. And now they're mostly commercial and, I don't know how to call it, like over standard. So a lot of new properties are too expensive and too huge for most people to afford. And yeah, that's why for foreign investors it still makes sense to actually try to buy out the apartments. But those are like three general ideas that why the situation is so complex. And of course, then the Airbnb who comes here actually solves some kind of problems. For example, this issue of trust is if I offer my place on the Airbnb, then first I don't have to care that this person would stay there for 3 months and then wouldn't leave because he or she is only here, for a week or two. And then I got, the payment in advance and I have everything insured, and then the Airbnb will again take care for something. So that was, for somebody who is a landowner in Ljubljana, that was a huge, let's say, positive feature as compared to how difficult it is to actually rent an apartment to somebody for a year.
Before moving to the next general question, which is obviously to address the elephant in the room, the COVID question, is to remind again the viewers that you can pose your questions in the chat and to pose them now, not at the end, so that organizers can collect them. So to return to the conditions why we are also streaming this, not doing this live, which is COVID. And like I said in the introduction, and like it was predicted by Francesco that we'll discuss about it, that the COVID crisis really revealed the housing crisis. It revealed the insecurity of the housing conditions for most or for a lot of people, that homes are not safe anymore because they are mostly treated as a financial instrument. So the general question would be how, especially for both speculative projects, how your projects would in a way address this safety question or insecurity question, or how do you think it will, if it would be realized, how it would pan out during the COVID crisis, or how it would address the housing questions that we see right now. And for Leonard at the end, how you already answered a bit about, you talked a little bit about Airbnb, but if you can a little bit expand on it. So again, in the same order, DOMA, Vienne, Leonard.
Okay.
Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if
we put it out because we didn't know, So we wanted you to tell us how to sort out that massive crisis. Okay, I'll just start by saying a few things, Maksym, and you can jump in. It's just that I think we're actually we can't even say that we're coming out of a global financial crisis. We're still very much living through the tail of it, and now this, which we don't know exactly, at what sauce we're going to be eaten, they say in France. I think there's also something very different in terms of like the relationship to housing between the crisis that we've just went through and the one in front of us. In as much as, again, the first one was really caused by the kind of financialization of housing, and therefore ended up being a crisis that started as a crisis of credit and an immediately financial crisis that then developed into an economic crisis in terms of its materialization in everybody's life. While here it starts the other way around, right? It's first an economic crisis. It's first a crisis of income, people losing their job, people not circuits of value no longer functioning, like the circulation of money no longer being like as fluid as it used to be, and therefore the consequences and the way it's going to impact the housing world is slightly delayed, right? Like people can no longer pay rent. So initially there's some like rent subsidies from government, but then, they will very quickly stop. And there's the problem of paying mortgages, etc., etc. So in any case, we see that whether it's at the beginning or the end, like the housing remains quite central to the question of the type of economic and financial crisis that our world can generate. With regards to how a project like DOMA, if it were to already exist today, how it would have been sort of beneficial, or how could it offer some level of security? we would need to enter into the nitty-gritty of things, but here, in general, we think again of DOMA as a cooperative, and a cooperative has this fundamental mutualistic aspect and strategy behind it, no? In as much as we are, the idea would be of like in this many-to-many relationship to housing, with like a multitude of urban residents owning shares of a network of properties across different cities at the same time. You've got room to sort of manage or somehow absorb some of the shocks of the market that end up being often very localized and very sort of happen abruptly and in a localized way, but not necessarily globally at the same time. And in general, we can imagine precisely, sort of mutual funds, how like essentially net shares of property held in common could become sort of mutual funds to support the entire group, the entire community of, let's say, stakeholders in a platform, rather than having individualized, residents having to, personally and individually deal with the consequences potentially adverse of this crisis. So this is, in very general terms, the kind of the necessity of neutralizing risk. I think is fundamental, and what we have right now is exactly the opposite. It's a sort of push to be super entrepreneurial and individualized in terms of like risk-taking, and therefore also the consequences are borne very individually. Sorry for this long answer.
Yeah, but that's why I was also confused by your question. If like we talk about distribution of risks and like kind of DOMA as a mechanism that tries to somehow allow for that. I mean, it's fairly obvious that like COVID is kind of strengthening all the inequalities and shows the kind of even further increases the kind of gap between this kind of renter and owner class and stuff like that. I mean, I also just wanted to add that on the other hand, like crises are often like our ways when we can kind of rethink, at least in some way, what is valuable and how things how things are kind of addressed in that regard. And like, I mean, I don't know, we have been researching a lot property tech, and especially what's happening in the US, which is like kind of a frontier of financialization of housing. And of course, all of that industry, with kind of Airbnb being one of the players in it, is kind of suffering now, because it's always like this when like the economy is going up, the demand is going up, and like so I just wanted to say that for me this kind of moment is also a chance to try to together think about what is valuable and how to make sure our kind of advancement in the kind of either it's regulation or generally how we talk about things that have to do with housing and how we as a society address that issue. How do we basically make sure that whatever the solution is, it translates what is valuable? And again, like from COVID, I think we all can kind of almost intuitively much better sense this kind of thing, that like houses are homes as opposite to financial products.
I think what you said is really important, and we already see it in praxis, because in comparison to the previous financial crisis, we saw housing organization only after the fact, after really the housing crisis really deepened, especially in Spain or UK or in the US. Now we already are seeing rent strikes, which is something that was not happening before, and it's also really it is a way to rethink housing and to rethink the way we organize around it. Vienne, could you continue also how to think about COVID and housing?
I mean, it's to be honest, I feel that, of course, COVID, with the red strikes and so on, you can see it's a little bit different from 2008. But in a way, the problem was there before. It's just that now people are striking against it. So it's a bit more evident, but we can look back at, for example, in 2008 when people lost their homes with the mortgage crisis. And then the fact that mortgage-backed securities are a big part of the financial market. And then, other than mortgages, rent is a source of income for investment banks. It's a very steady stream to fuel their investments and so on. So in a way, I feel the situation, at least with this question, as a first reaction, I feel that it certainly highlights. I think it highlights a problem, but I don't feel the problem is in any way new. In terms of how, so I guess maybe I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but I guess a lot of this is we start to see how much of the economy is actually based on real estate. So if you look at finance and economics, a lot of the evaluation to see if you're in a recession or not, a good chunk, there's a criteria of it that is real estate housing. So, you can have consumer spending, blah, 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 but there's also this sector for real estate. And if you see the extent to which this real estate factor props up the rest of the economy, if you take that away or if you adjust for it, we would have been in recession a long time ago. We wouldn't be in recession now, right? We're talking about recession like it happened in March. Come on, people! Like this people were talking about recession last summer. We just forgot about it. So I guess what I try to do is I'm trying to bind the currency part with the idea of strengthening the local economy through job creation and through basically supporting smaller local businesses and so on.
Leonard, do you have something to add about?
I absolutely agree. I think that, don't hold me on this, but I think that Davey Harvey wrote an analysis that the economic growth after the last financial crisis, after 2008, 2010, was basically fueled through this, how can I say, experience/traveling kind of spending. So a lot of people moving around, and instead of buying stuff like, not only cars and new phones and stuff like that, but they were buying and spending their money onto experience. Basically, it means food tourism, then all kind of how to actually move around the world, and Airbnb was extremely important part of this kind of spending, and a lot of work has been done, how to expand the airports and all this infrastructure of moving people around so that they could have experiences. And if this was really one of the biggest factor of economic growth that helped us come out of this last financial crisis, then I think that this sector will be extremely hit, because I don't really expect that traveling will soon come back to normal as it was, let's say, last year. I think that traveling will be part of a pretty tiring and problematic experience for quite a while. So I don't really expect this many people traveling around the world and filling all this offerings on Airbnb and other platforms. We have also seen from our analysis that and people who were running those Airbnb businesses also confirmed that in order to make it financially sensible to actually rent your apartment for short term on Airbnb, you really need to have quite a big occupancy rate. So if your place is rented for 70 or 80% of the time, then of course it makes sense to be on the Airbnb. But if it's like below that, and then you add all the costs of cleaning, being available and stuff like that, then even a student makes, a better investment than having your place on Airbnb with, let's say, 40 to 50% occupancy. So I think that quite a lot of things it's too early to say, but I don't really expect that Airbnb will be, at least for a couple of years, a very rational investment for anybody, but not for individual ones, but maybe only for those businesses who are running like 50 or more Airbnb places, and they can of course disperse their investment. And of course, so I see that there will probably be quite a lot of change soon, but as one of my friends, I think in Croatia also said, it was in Croatia and Slovenia, it was the same. It was almost impossible to even talk about regulating the platform because politics would not even touch the subject. And then maybe one minister would say, we should do something about that. And then the other minister would say, yes, but you know how many tourists this brings in? And Croatia is like, 20 to 25% of the GDP is tourism. And the only change that can probably happen from our countries is, can be if something terrible happens to Airbnb as such. So if they will be forced into another business model because otherwise they will just bust, then something will happen here. But I don't really expect much from our local politicians or the state to actually do anything about it.
Yeah. So for if you ended with the change, now we'll change the format, let's say. So we have 3 additional guests to post questions, and I'll give word to them. I think we'll start with Maruša.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thank you for your words, ideas, presentations, everything. My name is Maruša, and I'm a young fellow researcher at the Faculty of Social Sciences here in Ljubljana. I'm also a PhD student that is really interested in investigating platforms as a new business model. So my question, naturally, will be about platforms, and it goes to the creators of DOMA City platform. I could start by saying that, or you also can read out on many online pages or books, that point being of every platform is to create value for its users. But here, the financial worth of a commercial platform, on the other side, derives from its wide user base or by the achievement of a platform that it can achieve an exponential growth. So those are the so-called growing network effects. So the wider the user base of a certain platform, the more other users it will attract. So here I'm really interested if that is also your aim for the DOMA City platform, to achieve this kind of an exponential growth. And if your answer is yes, I'm again interested in by which group of stakeholders will you start, or will your tactics differ from city to city, perhaps? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Francesco basically wrote this little bit about platform cooperativism and how DOMA is part of that. So I feel like, Francesco, if you want to take this.
Sure. So thanks for your question. Yes, of course, we would want to grow exponentially and take over every world cities and turn all housing into a massive cooperative from which we would be all part. And to do this, of course, there is a dimension that is speculative, but we do think indeed, as like you, that there is an incredible potential in the very sort of organizational form of the platform for growth and for kind of, since we're using words that come from tech, let's call it disruption. Let's say a fast change of an existing model of relation, let's say, in particular in this case, ownership. So we're trying to use this platform organizational model as a way to scale up the very basic principle of the cooperative, right? In which, by just pooling resources together, you end up being able to be a stronger actor in whatever field you are and share the benefits collectively. And the kind of primary target user or audience, or user and member of this emerging cooperative and platform cooperative would be, the vast majority of urban residents that are currently structurally priced out of the housing market. And sorry, I go back to this point about the property ladder, but I think it's an expression that is really captures the kind of core of the housing problem today, of the housing question. That is, it is a condition in most of the sort of cities where housing has been over-financialized, in which as soon as you own a house, even with a mortgage, you're in a very stable, very kind of easy position. It's really not like rocket science to invest in housing in most of our cities. It's just a question that this extremely lucrative market is entirely sort of exclusive and completely inaccessible to the vast majority of urban dwellers today. And we have lots of statistics that show that it is structurally impossible for people just with their income, if they don't inherit or if they don't have like capital from other sources, to even not only to buy a house in cash, but even to access the kind of savings level that would be enough for a deposit for a mortgage, right? So in many cities, you've got this market, which is in fact a sort of exclusive little island from which people are structurally priced out. So a platform cooperative like DOMA tries precisely to sort of break into this market and allow a much wider user basis to finally access what is in fact the result of every single urban dweller's activity. If the way housing prices grow is because of people's life in the neighborhood that make it lively, dynamic, and it's only the landlord class that ends up capturing all this extra value generated collectively. So I think now this is a lot like rephrasing the scheme that we have presented before, but just to your question, we have thought about like lots of network effects and how to facilitate the growth and incentivize it once you are on the DOMA platform. We're thinking of many uses of the DOMA tokens themselves, this unit of value in the system as a currency, also something that speaks to Vienne project, that is how to generate a currency that is based and backed by the kind of assets of housing that we own collectively. But if I can just add a quick word about, of course, when we look at it in terms of rational economic terms, there's no reason why we wouldn't all jump into a project like that, I would think. The question is then, one of the main issues that we see in terms of the development of alternative models of housing, such as DOMA and many others, is cultural. Is that we have such a strong cultural attachment to the idea to this ambition, this sort of social ambition of owning our own home and being this sort of it may depend in certain contexts, but like there is globally a strong attachment to that, and the idea of shifting away from this goal towards a much more sort of collective, cooperative and shared model of ownership and relationship to this specific asset, which is a house, is difficult to digest for many, I think. And that's also why we see DOMA as a project that has a kind of, I wouldn't say pedagogical, but like kind of also well, cultural dimension in terms of opening up approaches to housing that are different from the ones we have inherited from, and which also imprison us in this never-ending housing crisis by the fact that we all hope for something that is structurally impossible for the many. Does that answer?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would just like to have one additional comment. I really agree with cultural barriers, because I think that here too in Slovenia or in Ljubljana, perhaps, if you like to present something that has a stain of the collective, or you would name it like cooperative, I think that people still, I don't know, they wouldn't like to be contaminated with the socialist past, or with being too collective. I think the frame here is like individual or libertarian even more. So yeah, thank you for your answer.
Thanks.
Evening, I'm Uroš, independent researcher, architectural researcher, and occasionally involved in tenant or housing struggles in Ljubljana. I have a question, well, maybe first a comment. I hope I won't be too vague, or I hope I won't backtrack too much the discussion. But I have a question for the model tactics, in a sense that, so the object of critique, or the condition that we're problematizing, your tactics actually presuppose all the necessary conditions that enable that state. So in what way, what do you think, or if you can elaborate, what is the basic level, what is the basic problem, what is the basic, if there is even a problem, if we're taking these things for granted, if we're presupposing all the necessary conditions of this problematic crisis of home, what is then actually to be fixed? And in regards to hacking, what is actually this disruptive, or what is this way of using tactics or tools that is actually not already the mainstream way of using these market tools or financial
So could you
tools?
just repeat again, what did you mean by the things that we take for granted? What was that?
Well, we began with the frames, and actually Klemen began with frames and given things. So I'm talking about the housing crisis, the structural conditions of the housing crisis, and all the proposals take them as actually for granted, as natural, isolated from the object of the proposed tactic.
So this is the question probably for Vienne and for DOMA.
Yes.
Okay. Who would like to go first?
I'm trying to understand the question a bit.
I think if I made the way I understand the question is that the point is that your models for example, DOMA model, the idea is that we generalize the value that is generated through the housing markets. So it presupposes that value is generated through the housing markets, and that we have like a wealth that is generated there. And I think that Uroš is probably problematizing this fact that value should not be generalized through value should not be produced through the housing system. There's supposed to nothing to be extracted from it, let's say.
Okay. I can go there. So I think I have a relatively easy answer to that. I'm not necessarily, in this proposed scheme, I'm not necessarily trying to say everyone get rich by by renting. What I'm trying to do is actually just to organize landlords so they don't rent out their place on Airbnb to make a living, and they don't, for example, sell their apartment to a foreign investor, but rather you create an organization whose aim is actually to secure the local economy. And so I'm not necessarily dealing with the housing crisis itself, but I'm trying to leverage the rather, I guess, I don't know if unique is the right word, but the very special condition of high home ownership rates in Croatia, but I also understand in the general Eastern European Balkan region, this very particular profile of home ownership to back to actually be the groundwork for developing a new economy. Does that make sense? Or did I answer the question? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also have a comment about that, in a sense that I mean, I think it's totally imaginable kind of to talk about these kind of completely different worlds in which housing plays a different role, value is not extracted from it. We have, like, you know, I was born in Soviet Union. When I was 1 year old, everyone got their home privatized, and I think 92% of people in Ukraine, where I'm from, were homeowners. I mean, we know, like, I'm also an architect, so, like, you know, from an architectural kind of world, there's a bunch of proposals that take this kind of artistic curiosity in kind of, you know, playing with a home that is a completely definancialized asset. Let's look at it. Let's try to think about other forms of community. There's a huge tradition of that also, obviously. But I think for us with DOMA, it is an interest to try to look at things that we can implement today and that can intervene into existing kind of situation. And they can somehow shift the kind of power dynamics in the world we live in. So, like, I mean, if you ask me, I'm curious about those kind of scenarios, but also I'm aware that, like, more than half of world's kind of wealth is real estate, right? And, like, when we know that that is an issue that also politicians are aware of, they will not deal, they will not do anything against it because they know that, like, the GDP will go down or something. You know, it's like you can't just deflate that kind of huge kind of amount of value. So at least for us, we are interested in kind of intervening into the world as it is, and with kind of trying to see what's possible to actually do now, to hack now. But at the same time, of course, we're curious about those questions. And, like, I don't know if Francesco, you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, we're more than curious. We agree with our colleague, the comment, I don't know your name, sorry, that essentially is asking, well, both your projects seem to accept the kind of commodification of home, and even the particular kind of commodification of home, the financialization of the home. Yes and no, as in we accept it tactically, as Maksym was saying, in terms of, like, acknowledging that that somehow a completely detached form of housing activism that simply claims the right to the city, that simply demands that housing is recognized as a human right, as we would all agree. I mean, I would personally totally agree with that, but de facto, it's been 40, 50 years that this model of claim and demand has been wiped out, essentially, and has been also quite strongly ineffective because of the general dynamic of the world's economy, and in which, again, as we heard, like, real estate, financialized assets have been the engine of global economic growth. So in front of these kind of monsters, we also have to try to think and act from the inside. And that is what Maksym was saying. But I also think that a collective And neutralized model of investment into a financial, as I said, like we're trying to propose, is a way in potentially the mid to long term to actually decommodify, because you can create then local pockets as well as a network of areas within which you are much more in control of the economic value of things. And you can decide that, well, actually, instead of paying whatever, a service, childcare, or something into money, I can use my own asset, which is this value which we own in common. And therefore you recreate bases of exchange that are not depending on the kind of on currencies, in fact, that are established, that are coming from federal banks, etc., etc. So you also have a way to, from the inside, actually begin the process of decommodification, from which you want to, at least you kind of raise the question of why don't we start from there? Well, we seem to think that starting from there is leading nowhere, but from the inside, maybe we can get back there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Maša Hawlina. I'm a sociologist also working with Zadrugator Housing Cooperative. And maybe to mention, Zadrugator is also a part of MOBA, European Cooperative Society, which was recently established, and is working towards becoming a financial intermediary institution for non-speculative housing projects. And it also brings together cooperatives from Eastern, South, and Central Europe. We're all basically initiatives for housing cooperatives who don't yet have housing cooperatives. So we're kind of in a similar starting phases as you are with your projects, or I got the impression. But my question would maybe turn away a bit from this kind of projects. And you already touched a bit upon this in the previous question, and also Vienne and Leonard before that. So it's basically all your projects are really working on this autonomous parallel projects, and not trying to intervene or cooperate with the state. So my question is it time to give up on pressuring the state to build affordable housing? Because I would argue that it still is the most efficient, and the state has the best tools to provide affordable housing for the ones who need it most. So yeah, is it time to give up on the state?
Can I?
Yeah,
I'm really happy to take this one. So I agree with you, and I don't think we should give up on the state. Because also there are also many reasons. Because in the end, we will also have a question of the governance. No matter we can start grassroots, but at some point you will if you want to scale up, you still have this question of governance. But one of the issues, which I'm probably also for Vienne as well, and actually for a lot of European countries, is that there is right now there isn't. It's been lifted, but normally % limit on your debt to your budget to debt ratio. So that if you are a member of the Eurozone, your government is limited in how much it can spend as public expenditure. So if you invest in public housing, that is part of your national expenditure. And if you invest so-called too much, you would go above the 3% limit, which is stated in the Stability and Growth Pact. So basically, that is one of the limitations. I think that is a ground that also needs to be fought upon. If we are also going to pressure the state, we also need to be aware that there is this limitation as well. Not to say that we should give up the state, but that's why I think parallel currency of some sort would come in handy. Although there would also be questions of legalities and so on, is that a parallel currency has because it's not a euro or kuna or whatever national currency, it has the added advantage of bypassing that 3% limit potentially, but there would have to be some, so.
I mean, I think that we shouldn't give up on state. Absolutely not, because that's what I think everybody wants us to do, especially in the platforms and the others who know very well that they enjoy this unregulated space and profit from it. But I think that one of the problems here is also that in Slovenia, it somehow doesn't really feel as urgent. But that's only my subjective feeling, because so many people are actually homeowners. And even now during the Corona times, people would probably rather just leave their apartment and maybe move back to their parents than go for a rent strike, because there is still an option. And we talked about that, like, the worst thing that can happen to my generation is that in my age, you would be forced to go back to your room that you had as a child, going back home. And then somebody said, yeah, sure, but it's still a privilege, because quite a few people around the world don't have even this option, to go back to your parents. And one of the things that's probably also true is that's why there's not such a sense of urgency to make any kind of policy out of it, because at least in Slovenia, a lot of this social burden is still put on the families. It's unclear how much of this social buffering is done by the families.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's also one of the reasons why we don't see this huge policy change. And even, I don't know, it's still, I think, that minority of people who are renting, especially if you have a family, you're considered quite weird if you're renting, that you're not having a loan or something. And I think that this will also change, because the structure of employment and unemployment will definitely change in Slovenia after the crisis in the following year or two. So even this idea that you can, I don't know, always have a safe job, and if you're a bank, you have pretty high conditions in order to be eligible to. But I think for now, quite a lot of people who are owners of property are still not really facing this reality check that will come pretty soon. I think that will also put additional pressure on the politicians to actually do something about it.
Yeah, but just maybe to add to this also, I mean, the kind of, as people who also, in parallel to developing this proposal, we of course study housing crisis in different parts of the world, and do a lot of workshops and trying to analyze how it works in different places. We understand that this idea of fully wild free market housing is not necessarily something that is even possible. Like if you look at patterns of housing crisis in Eastern European countries, or even different vast difference between Berlin and London, right? In one it's a complete financialization, in other there is this kind of very active state as a player in all of this. So I mean, we obviously talk about exactly. So I mean, the housing is regulated, and that kind of problem exists in a certain context in any case. So, I mean, we see the sort of the state as just one of the players that can also help with kind of, all of these goals that we have, probably we share here among people who talk here. But at the same time, my feeling is that we have a lot of work to do, just as Francesco said about this kind of cultural shifts in terms of showing different possibilities of how we can organize in different ways. Like Vivienne just mentioned governance as also something that we can prototype and think together about. And yeah, I mean, at least for us, we've been asked this question before because we also don't actively talk about our relationship to that matter. But for me, it's kind of the role of DOMA is partly to try to show a precedent of this kind of scalable growth that is inclusive, that is like, basically like to show the alternative, right? And I'm sure that that's kind of also what this kind of new wave of European cooperatives that are also, I hope, will be increasingly tech-enabled, will innovate on these kinds of issues of how to facilitate collaboration between a bit larger amount of people, to help them coordinate, even if they don't come from the same hip neighborhood or something. Of course, I also agree with everyone before that the state is an important player. It's just that, I would say we have to work along each other.
Exactly, in complement. And it's not meant to be an alternative. Like, I think, let's say, for a project like DOMA, is really not meant to replace or to just accept the kind of neoliberal dogma of the complete carving out of state and state power. On the contrary, in a way, we hope that projects like this can be a spark that can reactivate the idea of, putting the state as an engine behind massive projects and programs to address the kind of issues we're facing, be it in the housing sector, be it in the health sector, as we're seeing today, around like climate questions. There's a necessity to reactivate a certain desire for states, for state power, and not in the sense of, again, we immediately connect it to sort of a kind of authoritarian strength and weight on top of us, but really to rethink the state from the perspective of its, almost de facto dismantlement after 50 years of neoliberalism, and rethink it as something that can be this collective engine and power that can actually, face the kind of problems we have at scale. But again, I think it's about dissociating it from what this kind of state-led bureaucratic, standardized programs, especially of housing, are still, associated with when thinking about a massively state-led public housing program, right? We just need to define what the state is in this and redefine what the state is, I think.
And just a short follow-up question, maybe, because this is a problem we've been dealing with, is that for the first projects, it's really hard to provide very affordable housing to reach the most vulnerable parts of the population. So do you think that you'll be able to reach them with the DOMA project? And maybe if not now, what's the scale maybe of time in which you expect to do that, to be like a really possible alternative for also the most vulnerable parts of the population?
I don't think we're trying to be that, again, because we're not trying to become the state or be a kind of alternative to what the kind of social safety net that a society in which we would want to live should have, right? I mean, like, there's I think the kind
maybe
of provision...
the better phrased question would be, who are you addressing with the project? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, I mean, the very basic answer to that is that it's everyone who can afford rent. And we have this massive, as Francesco was saying in his presentation, we have this massive class of people who pay rent, who never see it back, and who kind of increasingly lose this hope to get on the property ladder. As Francesco said, it's probably not the sort of the intention to, strategize this project around this kind of 10-year plan, after which we immediately kind of can solve the issue of homelessness, for instance, which is like, of course, is a huge one. But for us, it's I always see it as this kind of amount of faders that we can play with, and we can find a solution that actually like provides a dynamic that shifts the status quo, right? So how do we make instead of increasing that gap between owners and renters, how do we kind of put them into the same community of interest? Instead of like with the Airbnb question, instead of thinking, I mean, the same thing applies, right? In terms of like, you have this kind of possibility to find the solution in which those kinds of people that still kind of presented as a socially innovative kind of project can be real, in a sense that it kind of helps a small kind of family to make some additional source of income. But in any case, yeah, for me, it's this kind of, I think about it as a kind of system of FEDES that tries to change the dynamics in the kind of, in the general system that it tries to address.
Thank you for your answers.
Yeah, and now we move to the last part. We have probably time for one of two questions from the viewers. Nika.
Hello. So the first question, perhaps for Vienne, by Jesse R. McKee. What would you need to build your currency? And you kind of briefly touched upon this, talking about issue with regulation, but if you perhaps just say, what would you actually need to build it?
I think it's actually a lot of organization on the ground, actually. I think the first part is actually getting landlords to come into the picture and to convince them that, instead of putting your house on Airbnb, that you could, if you participate in this currency, because most landlords are old people, right? Most of these are pensioners, and most, if you forget for the moment they're a landlord, most old people want their children to stay at least in the same country as them. But in the case of Croatia, for example, you have a massive brain drain effect due to the lack of job opportunities added on top of the expensive rent. So the idea is that there needs to be an organization organizing amongst landlords to convince them to back this currency scheme just by actually entering an agreement. I think the legal side is doable, but yeah, I think that would be the first big step.
Mm-hmm.
And now a question for DOMA. In your model, would investment only be available to residents, or would it be open to individual investors, I guess from somewhere else? And that's a question from Dominic.
Good question. In general terms, I mean, we see it open. First of all, we imagine in the long run to have DOMA as a multi-cities platform, something that is not necessarily specific to one city, but that is networked across different cities, precisely for also the reasons that we mentioned before, that is potentially creating also some safety nets around a system of sort of cooperation and mutual sharing of benefits that is also working within a financialized system that is also at risk. So, that means that you could buy DOMA tokens and invest in like cities and neighborhoods in which you don't even live. But the conditions for this to happen are something that we are designing right now, and that we can't answer in very generic terms. They really depend on the specificity of the context within which we would implement the platform and the scheme, because also it needs to be adjusted to local regulation, it needs to be adjusted to many different, sort of legal plus fiscal, like taxation questions with regards to, foreign investment. But of course, we're aware of the risk somehow that is built in the design to kind of also just be
like liquid.
Be hacked. hack, sort of hacking the hack and creating and using this for kind of further financialization, liquidification of equity, so that it gets diluted and sent and further concentrated by wealthy capital investors. We are designing precise sort of incentivization schemes that would somehow favor local investment. In a way, you could use your local knowledge of an area in order to invest specifically in a certain place and sort of capitalize on that local knowledge so as to turn it into also a form of value. So there's no clear answer, sorry, but it's technically possible, but with lots of caveats.
Well, the third question that I chose was kind of already answered, so I guess it's time that we kind of wrap it up, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
This was fun.
If that's it for the questions, I would like to thank the organizers again, and special thanks to all the guests. All the viewers should check the speakers, their bios, and check them out on the webpage of Aksioma. Especially check out the projects, and again, see you on the next Money Lab talk. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Klemen.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Klemen, for moderating the panel. Thanks to you as well, Vienne, Maksym, Francesco, Leonard, for sharing your thoughts with us. And thanks also to our special guests in studio and the audience online for your precious contribution. This event was co-produced by Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art Ljubljana, together with Kino Šiška in the framework of KON's platform for contemporary investigative art. In the next panel, entitled Tax Haven Normalized Grand Theft, scheduled for Monday, June 15 at 5 p.m. Central European Time, always at aksioma.org/moneylab8, we'll have investigative artists talking to an investigative journalist. rybn.org will take you on an intimate ride aboard the great offshore, guiding you gently through offshore finance in infamous locations like Malta to help you identify with the others. Then the Demystification Committee will show you how you can set up your own global corporate structure and even become one of them. The panel will be moderated by one of the leading Slovenian experts in the field, the investigative and data journalist Anuška Delić. Thanks for being with us today. See you next week.